All right, well, I think we are live and ready to go for this paper presentation 4B, so I will get it kickstarted. I'm Olivia Albrecht, and I'm head of PIMCO's ESG business strategy. It is my pleasure to moderate today's session on ESG, what do lenders want, do, and can do. First, let me offer my congratulations to the entire Columbia University team who's pulled together this impressive conference, representing the largest gathering of academics who work on sustainable finance and investments. And PIMCO is proud to participate in this week's activities. Today's session will focus on the role of credit investors and how lenders can play an important role in stimulating sustainable finance and some of the challenges of investors. Carol Kempa will present on the cost of capital for renewable and non-renewable companies, offering insights into the changing dynamics of that cost of capital for such firms over the past 20 years. Then will present on credit risk sensitivity of carbon pricing, analyzing how an increase in carbon pricing could impact a variety of sectors and individual companies. Nina Sega will present on the role of the banking sector to help accelerate the transition to which will require an active and forward-looking mindset from bankers. And finally, Christian Haas will present on low carbon investing and credit rationing, arguing strongly for the importance of carbon taxing as a means to help accelerate the low carbon transition. In terms of structure for the session, each speaker will present for about 10 minutes. And after all four presenters have spoken, I'll then open up the discussion for questions from participants. Please type your questions throughout the 45 minutes into the chat box over on the right-hand side of your screen for this Renmo presentation app, and then we will promptly wrap up at the top of the hour. But before we dive into the specifics of the session, let me set the stage for the presentation and taking a moment to contextualize sustainable investment trends in light of 2020 events. As one of the largest bond managers globally and a leader in sustainable fixed income, PIMCO is well positioned to moderate the session and very excited to do so. So first, in terms of 2020, the global pandemic is arguably the first global sustainability crisis of the 21st century, and it's likely to help accelerate action among investors on long-term sustainability crisis. For many of us, the profound events of 2020 have really illuminated just how interconnected, interdependent, and vulnerable the world is to potential challenges that climate change will bring. And so far this year, we've seen a start of supply shocks, a global pandemic, and now protests and demonstrations across the globe regarding social justice. COVID-19 is first and foremost, of course, a humanitarian crisis that is disproportionately affecting the world's poorest and most vulnerable. But it's also turned into an economic and sustainability crisis. At PIMCO, we're focusing on these disruptive forces, not only out of basic human compassion, of course, but because we believe that in order to maintain a robust economy going forward, and therefore generate jobs and opportunity, growth has to be fundamentally sustainable. If growth is pursued without regard for material, environmental, social, and governance risks, we believe the health of people and our planet may suffer. Natural resources will become scarcer and out of reach for many, and social unrest will become more disruptive, leading to extreme political outcomes. And a lack of governance principles may preserve abusive, inefficient, and unequal organizations and societies. As citizens of this world and leading capital allocator, we must engage in our area of expertise, and for PIMCO, that's the bond markets, to help drive change. And we believe the size of the bond market and the recurring nature of debt issuance makes fixed income investors a meaningful force in driving sustainable change. PIMCO is well positioned to engage with hundreds of companies and governments around the world, and we can help steer those companies and public offices towards a more sustainable growth model for the benefit of all. So let me kick off the session by clearly stating that as investors, we can help steer companies and public offices toward a more sustainable growth model. But we need more investors on board, more asset managers, more issuers, more asset owners to push together in the same direction in order to bring cohesive change sooner. So let us now listen to the papers for this presentation to brainstorm together how lenders can play an important role in accelerating sustainable finance. So first up is Carol Kempa presenting on the paper, The Cost of Debt of Renewable and Non-Renewable Energy Firms, Evidence from Loan Data. Carol, you're started.
Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction. My screen. I hope you see my screen now. Exactly. Yeah, thank you, Olivia, for the nice introduction. And I'm very happy to be here to present my joint work with my colleagues Ulf Mooslerner and Oliver Schenker on the financing costs of energy firms based on known data. So given the time restrictions, maybe just our background, the motivation in a nutshell. So as already said in the introduction, we know that if you want to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, as agreed in the Paris Agreement, we need a transformation of the global energy sector. And what is typically discussed and is new in the literature and the public are different barriers that impedes or slows down this transition towards a low carbon economy. For example, non-internalized environmental externalities like greenhouse gas emissions or positive externalities of innovation that might reduce the incentives to actually innovate. But rather recently, scholars stress the importance of also well-functioning capital or credit markets for this transformation. In our paper, as the title says, we cost of debts of energy firms. So why is this an important topic? Well, first of all, in general, debt is a very crucial and important source for firms to finance their operations and investments. And if there are higher risks inherent to new carbon sectors, in particular if those are rather new and involve new technologies compared to already established, rather carbon intensive sectors, this might cause problems for the firms to actually access the debt. So typically there are information asymmetries and costly screening processes on the side of the banks, which might induce higher cost of debt or even credit rationing. So if those banks or lenders cannot really assess the risk of those new low carbon technologies, these might be the effects we actually see. And furthermore, banks might have an incentive to finance incumbent technologies. Some literature found as if actually technological progress happens, for example, towards low carbon technologies, the value of the knowledge stock of the bank of the incumbent technologies might actually erode. So this is an additional potential driver. So basically what you can derive from this is that there could be higher cost of debt for clean or low carbon energy firms, and this might be an additional barrier for this low carbon transformation. And what we do in this paper here is we do a first empirical investigation on the costs of debt of firms developing and producing renewable energy technologies, renewable energy firms as we call them, and non-renewable energy or fossil fuel firms. So what is the data that we actually use here in a nutshell? So the basis of the core of our data is loan data on syndicated loans from Bloomberg to firms in OECD countries between 1996 and 2018. The interesting about this data, why we actually use it, is that Bloomberg has an own industry classification system that defines an energy sector and allows us to differentiate between loans to renewable energy firms, so equipment manufacturers or biofuel firms typically, or non-renewable energy firms, so oil and gas equipment manufacturer or service companies in those sectors, for example. Important point here is what is not included are electricity producing firms such as utilities or independent power producers. So we don't look at the very last end of the value chain, actually electricity producing firms, are basically anything that is there beforehand. And what we get from the data is information on the loan spread, this is our dependent variable we look at, and information about the loans like the issue date, the loan amount, maturity, and whether the loan is secured with collateral or not. And then we take this loan data and match it to firm level data from Compustat to get relevant firm characteristics that, according to the literature, possibly affect the cost of debt, like the firm size, profitability, leverage, and so forth, just to control for these factors. And in the end, we also look at some country level data, namely the OECD's Environmental Policy Stringency Index, and the IMF's Financial Institutions Index, which is a sub-index of the Financial Development Index that looks at banks, insurance companies, and mutual and pension funds. We do this to analyze the potential effects of environmental or climate policy and financial sector development on these cost of debt. And this is just one plot of the data. What I did here in the background in the shaded colors, I just plotted the loan spreads of all loans we have in the data of renewable and non-renewable energy firms. And the thicker the lines that are darker points and triangles are the annual means. And what we actually saw, just looking at the data as a small pattern, is that maybe around until 2007, we see on average renewable energy firms have higher costs of debt, higher loan spreads than non-renewable energy firms. Then from 2007 onwards until around 2011, there's no clear trend. There's like, they change a bit. And then from 2012 onwards, more or less the cost of debt are always, or like on average in all years, lower for renewable energy firms. So what we actually want to do in this analysis, we observe this trend or this picture as a motivation and want to see, okay, is this just an artificial thing that we observe, or do we still see this if we control for relevant loan and firm characteristics? Do we still see a systematic difference between both sectors? And in a nutshell, we estimate two different models. The first to analyze whether there is a difference between renewable and non-renewable energy firms' cost of debt. We estimate this model number one. So on the left-hand side is the credit spread. And on the right-hand side, we have different loan characteristics, firm characteristics at T-1, so the newest information available to the bank. And we have a dummy variable that just gives us that's equal to 1 for a renewable energy firm and 0 otherwise, which we interact with time variables for different time periods to see whether this difference changed over time, as we've seen in the picture before. And in the second step, we include in our model information on a country's environmental climate policy and the development stage of its financial sector to see whether those two variables drive the differences that we actually observe. And here's the results of the first model in a nutshell. So I don't show you the whole regression table. This is just the effect of renewable energy in basis points. So the difference in the cost of debt of renewable energy firms compared to non-renewable energy firms, controlling for all the characteristics that I've shown you. And what we see that on average, until 2006, renewable energy firms pay on average around 40 basis points more for their loans, while in the subsequent period, so from 2007 onwards, renewable energy firms have actually lower cost of debts in the margin of between 70 and 90 basis points. Here is an overview of our main regression results, not showing you the coefficients for the control. So in column 1, you see basically the coefficients the previous figure is based on, but if you look at columns 2 and 3, these are our main results concerning environmental policy stringency and the financial sector development. So if you look at column 2, you see a negative and significant coefficient for the interaction of renewable energy and the EPS index, which shows that an increased environmental policy stringency reduces the cost of debt of renewable energy firm. And here is actually expressed in standard deviation. So one standard deviation increase of the EPS index reduces the cost of debt of renewable energy firms by almost 19%. And we find the similar result qualitatively for the FI index. So the more developed a country's financial sector is, in particular its financial institutions, the lower are the cost of debt paid by renewable energy firms compared to non-renewable or fossil fuel firms. And here's just a small additional visualization on our results on the EPS index and the FI index. So what you can see here is just adjusted predictions of the cost of debt. So basically what our model predicts for the cost of debt of renewable and non-renewable energy firms for, on the left-hand side, different percentiles of the EPS index. So going from the left, from the 10th percentile to the 19th percentile, you see that the more ambitious or the more stringent an environmental policy is, the lower are the cost of debt of renewable energy firms. And the same we depict on the right-hand side for financial sector development, where we see also the further development in the financial sector is the lower are the costs of debt for renewable energy firms compared to non-renewable energy firms. In addition to these main results that I briefly presented to you, we also in our paper run quite a few of robustness checks. So the main one maybe is we do a propensity score matching based on loan and firm characteristics, because although we control for these factors, the firms, well, are quite different. In particular, if you look at firm size, on average, non-renewable energy firms are 3 times larger. So what we do here is we match our observations for renewable energy firms to those loans for non-renewable energy firms to have a similar sample and run the estimations on this match sample and find basically the same effects that I've just presented to you. And in addition, we also define alternative definitions of the time periods. So not 3, sometimes 4 or 5 periods, and find similar effects. We include different dummy variables. And in our data, actually 72% of loans are issued to US firms. So to control that this is not just a purely American phenomenon, we estimate all our models just using data from non-US countries, and by and large, we find that our findings remain robust. So to sum up, well, we basically find something like potentially a reversal of fortune. So before 2007, renewable energy firms pay on average a markup of at least 26% or 41 basis points on the cost of debt. This situation changes afterwards. So from 2007 onwards, renewable energy firms paid between 19 and 27% less for their loans compared to non-RE firms. Right? These numbers here again taken the years based on our main model specification, but even if we define different time periods, we see that this trends over time. So our interpretation is, well, risk in the renewable energy sector seem to have declined as those technologies and markets have matured over time and the business models are better understood by banks. And in contrast, what we seem to see is something that fossil fuel firms or firms engaging in fossil fuels sectors are perceived as increasingly risky by banks, so their cost of debt seem to increase over time, and environmental policies and the development actually of the financial sector appear to be an important driver for these identified developments. So
thank you.
That's it for me.
Thank you, Carol. That was an excellent overview. I was particularly interested in the work that you were doing over the time series to show that this phenomenon had a dynamic shift over the past several years. And that's something that obviously from a market perspective, we've seen as well, where coal manufacturers, coal miners are no longer investment grade credit worthy issuers at this point, and that's been a big shift over the past several years, just to kind of see that phenomenon play out in the markets. And even still, we're seeing the phenomenon play out with utility companies. I'll be interested in your comments, perhaps in the Q&A around the utility sector, where we've even seen a pricing differential between those utilities that still are heavily dominated by fossil fuels versus those that have retooled their business more toward nat gas and renewable energy projects. So wonderful. Thank you. We'll look forward later in the session. And as a reminder to everyone listening, please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A section over on the right-hand side of your screen. Next up, we'll have Vincent Boucher presenting on credit risk sensitivity to carbon pricing. So I will invite Vincent to turn on his screen and we will get started with the next presentation.
Hi everyone, so I'm going to try to share my screen. Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen and the presentation. So hi everyone, thank you very much to Grassfield organization for this opportunity to present our research. So this is a working paper written with Théo Le Guéné et al. We are both PhD students at ENSAE and École Polytechnique in France under the direction of Peter Tankoff, Patricia Crifo, and Nicolas Motis. And we also work for Amundi and Caisse des Dépôts Group. So I imagine that most of you are already familiar with the notion of transition risk. In this paper, we will focus on one of the components of transition risk, which is the effective carbon price. That is a price that companies have to pay or will have to pay to emit greenhouse gas emissions. So it can be taxes or exchange rate exchange, as it will be discussed later. As we both work in financial institutions, we thought to develop a methodology to estimate the credit risk associated with an increase in the carbon price at the level of each corporate counterparty. So that's mostly our question. And then we wanted to see the impact of different scenarios and different horizons that we will develop later. So the literature on the subject of transition risk is relatively recent, but already quite extensive. One way to organize it is to differentiate 3 types of research questions. The first consists in estimating the quantity of assets exposed to transition risk, which has been particularly done by regulators. A second question looks at the potential losses in the future on these assets, and our research definitely falls into this type of question. And finally, but I will not elaborate on this point today, a third question is about to what extent these risks are already priced by the market, which was the subject of the previous presentation from Carl. On this graph, we present potential losses from different papers in the literature. Obviously, the perimeters and the horizons of these studies may differ, which makes these results difficult to compare. However, we can already note that for climate-relevant assets, potential losses by 2040, 2050 might reach 30 to 40% of their asset value. So we see the potential losses very important for the sectors, which justify why we study the credit risk for the sectors. Why focusing on the carbon price? I think in the introduction, I talked about the effective carbon price. On this slide, we show the difference between the effective carbon price and the social carbon price, or the effective carbon price that would be required to change, to incentive companies to change their technologies. So basically what we see on this graph is that today, close from 80 to 90% of the carbon price initiatives are under the required price to limit the global warming to 2 degrees. So there is still a big gap, and this gap may be a risk in the future if regulators and politics decide to increase this price. It might cause a credit risk, and that's what we wanted to study in this research. So basically what we did is we defined a different set of scenarios, both in the long term, so until 2060, and in the medium term, 2023. For the long term, what you can see on the right part of the slide, there are carbon prices, global carbon prices taken from IPCC scenarios. And on the medium term, we used the current carbon prices differentiated by region. So we have, as you can see with different colors, we have different regions where we took the effective carbon price, the current effective carbon price. And then we defined 2 scenarios, an acceleration and a trend scenario. So basically then the question of how to the transmission channels between a rise in the carbon price and the credit risk. So in our model, we only consider the impact on operating expenditure. Among other things, it allows us to have a common methodology for all sectors, which was one of our criteria. And we take into account emissions by geographical area of the company. So in other words, if emissions in a country subject to the EU ETS system, for example, or French tax, carbon tax, will not have the same impact as an emission in another country without any effective carbon price. So in terms of the model, so it's a very straightforward theoretical model where the carbon cost for a company is defined as a shock on its EBITDA, which has an impact on the enterprise value through a ratio that we computed for each company. And then we take into account the historical volatility of this enterprise value and the financial structure of the company, so it means the debt level, through a Merton model to obtain a theoretical default probability. So in doing so, we try to take into account both the company's carbon intensity, which is the first parameter, its economic structure through its margin, and its financial structure through its debt ratio, in order to measure transition risk. I'll now present some results. First of all, I will present long-term results. As I told you before, we have also medium-term results, but I won't have time to present them. On the long term, we observe here the percentage of companies per sector with a theoretical probability of default of more than 99%. Basically, companies doing default. First of all, what we see is that three sectors seem particularly sensitive: energy, utilities, which is power generation, and materials, including steel. So these sectors have already been identified in the literature as climate relevant, and we confirm these results. But secondly, and I think that's what is interesting there, is we can see that the breaking points are not the same depending on the sectors. For example, for the utility sectors, the number of companies in difficulty increase rapidly and then stabilize. It's the red line on the top. If we take the more disruptive scenario, so SSP 219, which is close from 1.5 degrees. And conversely, for energy and materials, it increased much later. Another results that we did in the second step, basically, we applied the opposite reasoning. We calculated for each company its carbon price threshold, above which its default risk increased significantly. And on this graph, what you can see is on the y-axis, this threshold, and on the x-axis, its carbon intensity. So what we see on this graph is, of course, we have a correlation, but we also find many exceptions. Particularly if you look at the energy sector, and these results show that it confirms the importance to take into account the economic and financial structure when measuring the transition risk, and not only the carbon intensity of these companies. So in the end, what do we retain from this study? I think first, what we find is that the impact on the credit risk is very limited in the medium term, and also in the long term for 1.8, for example, degree scenarios, including in acceleration scenario in the medium term. And this confirms the possibility of a rapidly increasing the carbon price without generating a widespread default risk. So I think that's maybe a more policy dedicated result. Second, long-term risk is concentrated in three sectors already identified in the literature as climate relevant: energy, utilities, and materials. What is interesting is, as I told you, we observe different breakpoints depending on the sectors, and also I didn't show you this in the slides, but you can see it on the paper. We also observe very different distributions of the impact. So impact on the utility is much wider than on other sectors. Finally, we find that the economic and financial structure of the firm matters when measuring this carbon risk. And in practice, we think that measuring this risk through a carbon threshold, as we showed in the previous result, may be easier for a financial institution to follow this transition risk, because they can just compare it with current and future carbon prices through market prices or through taxes, for example. Of course, these results should be considered with caution. As mentioned in the introduction, they only capture one component of the transition risk, and there are many other different ones, like technological ones, that will be considered in the next papers. And in the future, and that's something we are working on at the moment, it would be appropriate to allow these companies to reduce the emissions, so to capture dynamic, and to increase their selling price to reflect the carbon price. But we think that this model has to be specific to each sector and ideally to each geographical area, so we can improve the assignment of local carbon pricing. But in this first paper, we wanted to remain more general and global and have a first set of results.
Thank you, Vincent. Really appreciate you walking through the details of the paper. And I'll be curious, perhaps in the Q&A, to talk about the dynamics of a global carbon pricing scheme versus local ones, and the pros and cons of different structures. But okay, with that, we can shift gears now, and Nina Sega will be presenting on Bank 2030, accelerating the transition to a low carbon economy. So I will invite Nina to join, and I will pause to make sure that your slides are being shown correctly as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Let me just make sure that I'm opening the slides correctly. And I think you should be able to see it. Olivia, can you see me? Or rather, can you see the slides, even more importantly? Olivia?
Sorry, got off mute. All right, have a good one. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. My name's Nina Siga. I'm a research director for sustainable finance at the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And I'll be talking to you about our work on Bank 2030, accelerating the transition to a low carbon economy. Let me start by talking a little bit about CISL. We are a department within the University of Cambridge, and we do some things that departments usually do, namely education and research. And actually, thank you to Vincent for referencing some of our earlier work. That was quite lovely of you. But we also do some things which are not quite standard for university department. Namely, we've got an accelerator, but also we convene leadership groups. And within the Center for Sustainable Finance, we've got 3 leadership groups: Climate-Wise, which is our group for the insurance sector; Investment Leaders Group, our group for investment managers and asset owners, as well as the Banking Environment Initiative that has collaborated with us on this particular piece of work. And actually, I'll say it's also a very particular pleasure to have Olivia introduce me, because PIMCO is a member of the ILG. And from what I've seen, we've got a couple of other members of our groups in the audience. So this particular piece of work has been done to understand how can banks play an active role in accelerating the transition to a low carbon economy. And also conversely, what does the Bank of 2030 look like? It was co-authored with Grant Rudgley and Yasminka Enderle. So thank you very much for quite a lot of work there, as well as we've had a number of collaborators across the practitioner space as well as the academic space. So this is very much a combined work. Let me talk you through the methodology. We started the work with quite a bit of desk research, and that research concentrated on the academic as well as practitioner literature, and we looked into 2 types of literatures. One is, what does a net zero economy look like? What kind of sectors need financing? And the second one is, what type of financial products are currently existing in the market? Based on that, we did 100 interviews across the project banks, non-project banks, as well as major corporate and development banks. Out of 188 interviews were with senior bankers and 12 with subject matter experts, as well as representatives of some major household name corporates. In terms of who we've spoken in the banking community, we've tried to get quite a diverse sample across the various product spectrum. So anywhere from project finance to development finance to microfinance, bankers responsible for sustainability linked loans or other types of collaborative finance, as well as looking at particular sectoral specialists. And you can see a little bit more within the expertise areas here. We were guided in our work by an expert group, which was comprised of members of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, as well as the high-level expert group on sustainable finance. So let's get into the interesting bit, namely, what did we find across these interviews? We have seen that there's a particular journey that the banking sector would take towards financing a net zero economy. Currently, most of the banks find themselves within the banking as usual zone. So effectively, there is a focus on efficiency. They're very client-led. It doesn't mean that they're not doing anything in terms of sustainability. They will have exclusion policies. They will be financing renewables. But the mindset is very much, if the client is not asking me about a sustainability-linked loan, I'm not going to go and try to talk with that client about it. Pioneers of today find themselves in the zone of transition, who are conceptualizing sustainability and as a strategic concern. So in effect, they don't ask whether we will transition to a net zero economy. They ask, when will that transition take place and how will it take place? And what role will their bank play? So they're in the process of empowering their employees to address these concerns and beginning to align the business model. And then we would see the banking sector move towards the zone of institutionalization, where most banks would have incorporated forward-looking analysis based on the risk and the finance side. They would have financed clients which are aligned with the net zero economy, developed a reputation for it, scaled pioneering practices, and effectively ensured that the capital is acting for the long term. Now, the question that this particular transition has spurred is, well, how do we get there, right? And what does a bank need to look like when it's moving across this journey? So here we start with adapting the banking business and operating model. So if a bank sees sustainability as a strategic imperative and includes that within its strategy, it starts to empower its employees. It dedicates resources to educating its employees, to effectively supporting its risk management function, to incorporate climate-related and others, not only climate, other types of environmental source of risk into their daily risk systems. It starts engaging with its existing product offer and starts thinking about, how do we transition our clients? How do we take them on this journey towards a net zero economy? Now, when we think about what does a bank look like internally, then we also need to think about, well, what does it need to do? And effectively here we're talking about the 4 ways that banks can accelerate the transition. And the first one is very much around closing the gap with green lending and investment products. So if we look at the financial products that currently exist within the financial market, we see that a lot of them are tailored at the institutional clients and at the large caps. We see that most of them are done without any sort of credit exposure. However, what we also need to see is we need to see the market orienting themselves towards SMEs, working with individuals, and expanding that product coverage to enable a much fuller range of clients to engage with the transition. The second is this whole idea of creating a shared vision with others. So it's not only around having a bilateral conversation between a bank and a client. It's also about bringing external experts that will help the client transition into a new way of normal, into a new way of operating, into the new strategic imperatives. The third is about, how do we expend coverage? And here the conversation was very much around the sectoral as well as the geographical coverage. So within the sector, we see that there is quite a lot of work being done in the renewables and the energy efficiency space. But what we also need to see is financing of the agricultural practices, financing of the hard to abate sectors, and seeing how can we work with those clients to transition. In addition to that, if we think about the geographical coverage, again, a great sustainable product is the one that sits in a developed market with an investment grade client. But the question is, how do we serve emerging markets where a lot of this need is found? And last, but definitely not least, the question is around innovation. So how can banks price externalities into their products, as well as in some cases extend their remit into new areas, such as offering, for example, electric vehicles as service and going down those routes? So let me summarize. In effect, we have this journey from the banking as usual, which starts with adapting the business and the operating models, moving away from a passive mindset where a client effectively is just asking for stuff, but developing a more active one, addressing strategy, educating and empowering employees, and integrating sustainability into risk, product, and climate management, and client management, excuse me. Then it's, how do we leave this kind of bank as usual mode of operating via the strategic forward-looking approach and creating a shared vision with clients and experts. We move then on to accelerating the financing of low carbon opportunities by scaling pioneering practices and innovating and expanding offering. And that's when we get to the stage where banks are financing a net zero economy. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions. And if we don't get to chat right now, do email me with further questions.
Thank you, Nina. That was an excellent presentation, and based off of my casual observations in the market, I can suggest that there is a need for a transition from business as usual in the banking sector toward a shared strategic vision towards sustainable financing. And that focus on the active, forward-looking mindset, I think, will be a critical one. And there are certainly some banks who have embraced that mantra and that attitude already, and I'm sure they will be successful in the years ahead. So I will look forward to additional questions later. And again, as a reminder, please feel free to submit your questions into the Q&A section. We will likely only have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions, but we'll try and get to as many of those questions that have been submitted ahead of time. Now, final presentation will come from Christian Haas, presenting on the low carbon investment and credit rationing. So I invite Christian to turn on his camera and turn on his mic and get started. Thank you.
Okay, let me just... try to share my screen. Unfortunately, it's not working. Let me just try again. May I just ask, Carol, do you have the presentation with you? Unfortunately, I can't. Maybe, or maybe, can you see my?
Yes, all good. Or it was all.
Olivia, is it possible? Can you see my screen?
We did for a minute, but now we don't. Do you think that you could send it to somebody and then we could pull it up on a different screen, or perhaps you can just speak to some of the slides? Looks like we got Carol to do it. Thank you.
For me? Okay. Sorry for the delay, but thank you for the introduction. Yes. Okay, very well. Carol, maybe you can assist me and I can just tell you when to skip to the next slide. And yeah, I'm glad finally that I have the chance to present work that I've done together with Carol Kemper, who already presented here in this session on low carbon investment and credit rationing. Maybe you can skip to the next slide. And the background of this paper is the fight against climate change, of course, as other papers in the session. And in particular, this fight should be done by decoupling economic activity and the use of finite resources. And next slide. And typically, when we talk about how to have this transition to a low carbon economy, we typically talk about externalities where we don't have the right price on it. So, for example, the global carbon price, the discussion is one example of the negative externalities where we don't have the right price. And recently, the discussion has focused on the role of financial markets, but what we often do not consider is the role of information asymmetries. And although it is quite well known that information asymmetries might lead to market failures on financial markets, for example, and hence as a result lead to suboptimal allocation of resources. Next slide, please. Thanks. And in the context of low carbon investments, it's quite surprising that we don't focus on information asymmetries and the role of financial markets in that particular case, because low carbon investments typically are very capital intensive, and so they rely heavily on services provided by capital markets. And what we also see is that there are some mature technologies, but there are also a broad variety of relatively new technologies on this market. And we see a lot of young firms with only limited prior relationship with lenders. So it's pretty likely that we have some kind of information asymmetries here, or the risk of information asymmetries here on the market. So overall, capital markets are very relevant, and we might have some risk of information asymmetries. Could you please skip to the next slide? Yeah. So our approach was to theoretically analyze the role of information asymmetries on capital markets for this transition to a low carbon economy. And on the next slide, I can tell you a little bit about the framework. We used a principal agent model with information asymmetries between borrowers and lenders. And we have a model with three types of actors. We have the firms on the one hand, and the bank who provides capital, and then the government as well. Next one. And what we analyze is the decision of the firms whether they want to continue to use a dirty technology that they used in the past, or invest into a clean technology, a low carbon technology. And if they try to invest in the clean technology, then they need the services of the capital market, the external financing. And what we assume with respect to the firms is that each firm has a particular dirty technology, and that some firms, when they use the dirty technology, they cause high emissions, and some other firms maybe have only low emissions when they use the dirty technology. And with respect to the clean technology, we assume that some firms have characteristics that they have a high success probability when they invest into clean technology, and other firms have a rather low success probability. And then firms decide whether they should do the clean investment, switch to the clean technology based on the return. This is what you see in the next slide. And here you see a graph. We see all four types of investors, as we have two types for the dirty technology and two types for the clean technology. And here the dark bars correspond to the private return from a dirty technology investment, and the green bars are the private returns from using the clean technology. And here's the perspective when we don't have a carbon price, and in that situation, all firms decide to go with the dirty technology. And on the next slide, you see the societal perspective. Of course, as the emissions cause social costs. And here we see that for the type 1 and type 2, these are the firms where when using the dirty technology, they cause high emissions. And for those, it would be from a global or societal perspective, it would be better that they switch to the clean technology, whereas the type 3 and type 4, the types of firms that are causing only low emissions, remain with the dirty technology. And that is the next click. Yeah. How can we, so the question from a societal perspective is, how can we achieve this allocation that some of the firms with really high emissions switch to the clean technology? Well, the most intuitive approach is we need a carbon price so that they internalize the social costs that are caused by their emissions. And this is where we started with our analysis. We started with a perfect carbon price, and then, and this is on the next slide, what our main finding is that this emission tax, the carbon price, indeed incentivizes the high emission firms to switch to the low carbon technologies. That is what we typically have as a result. But if clean technology is rather risky, then due to asymmetric information on the financial market, credit rationing occurs, which leads to the situation that some of the investors, some of the firms which would like to apply the low carbon technology are confronted with unfavorable loan conditions and hence decide to remain using the dirty technology. And we then started to think about what can we do about this issue. And as a second result, we came up with solutions. First, a public interest subsidy or loan guarantee. We show that this is possible to resolve the issue of credit rationing by providing these two instruments. And then we analyzed the situation where the carbon price is politically not feasible, and we found that an interest rate subsidy is also an appropriate instrument to incentivize clean investments. However, this will lead to misallocation, hence it will only generate a second best solution. And in a dynamic analysis, we also found that the necessity of government intervention on credit market is finite, as over time, of course, technologies will mature, the clean technologies, based on realized on spillovers from realized clean investments. And we also found the risk that if we don't or only delayed intervene on financial markets, if there is the risk of credit rationing, then you might have the risk of substantial welfare loss. And additionally, and this is also very interesting, I guess, is that low carbon technology risk adversely affects short and long run welfare gains. This means that if low carbon technology is rather risky, then the short run gains are rather low, but the long run gains are very high. And these main findings can be translated into policy implications. And a main point here is that, from this paper, is that a global carbon price is really the key for an effective and cost-efficient transition to a low-carbon economy, and we should only use the public finance instruments to address financial market imperfections, but not as mean to incentivize the clean investments. Yeah, so we should use the combination of a carbon price and public finance instruments if there are problems on the financial markets. And the last point here is associated with the result from the dynamic analysis, namely that if we have to, due to some reason, policymakers that are rather short-term oriented, then they might have an incentive in a situation where the technology is rather risky, the clean technology is rather risky, and hence we might have relatively high welfare gains in the long run. They might have incentives not to tackle the problem of credit rationing, as the short-term gains are rather low. And this is something that we have to keep in mind, maybe if we talk about politics and how we can tackle this problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian and Carol. Thank you for stepping in so gracefully and flipping through those slides as well. I'll invite all of the speakers to turn on their cameras and stay on mute while we take a couple of questions. In the interest of time, I think we will only have the opportunity for one question during this specific panel. However, as noted, we have a networking session that will last for 15 minutes past the hour, where you can find each other in the networking section of the conference right now and answer each other's questions. So with that, I will ask the crowdsourced 4-vote question to Nina on the group Q&A. And that is now 5. Thank you for whoever just voted. Nina, that was you. No, I'm kidding. Can you elaborate how do you think banks in rich countries and the broader financial system can solve the investment trap in developing countries? I know it's a big topic, but I'm sure one that you've got a lot of insights into. So I'll leave the floor to you now.
Thank you, Olivia. And I know that Hughes never asks us any easy questions, actually. No, I mean, that is one of the biggest problems we've currently got, is this idea that we've got low rated effectively investments sitting in emerging markets, which need the most. I think there are a couple of ways to think about addressing those. Securitizations is one of them. Involving the multilateral development banks is another one, because we currently, I find, have a situation where the MDBs do play in a sustainable market, but they do less of credit enhancement role and more of actual kind of supporting very particular transactions. So I think there are some ways to start addressing this problem, but I think we still have quite a long way to go to figuring it out. And I think probably the way forward is quite a lot of trial testing and seeing which products work, which products are best suited.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you, Nina. And I will just kind of conclude the session today. I think it was a really awesome session with speakers focused on all the different facets of the complexity of sustainable finance and the role of capital markets to help address the transition to a low carbon economy, starting with Carol, who focused on the cost of debt and renewable and non-renewable energy firms. I know there are a few follow-up questions for you on the specifics on your research that I'm sure folks will be interested in gathering, perhaps in the networking session. Next to Vincent to talk through credit risk sensitivity to carbon price. I'm sure there will be folks who want to talk about global dynamics of carbon pricing versus local dynamics, and also perhaps getting into the politics and policy landscape in the years ahead, particularly here in the US, but in other parts of the market and global economy as well. And then Nina presenting on Banks 2030, that acceleration to financing the low carbon economy. And there'll be additional questions, I'm sure, for you, either from Hughes or otherwise. And then lastly, with Christian presenting in a nice paper that complements, I think, some of the research work from Vincent and that team with low carbon investment and credit rationing. So with that, I just want to thank the speakers today for your flexibility and for your presentations. They were excellent. I learned a lot, so thank you. And for those of you who are listening to the session, thank you for your participation and your questions. And lastly, thank you to Rena for your support in making the presentation happen. You guys are all adjourned now.
Olivia.